Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval monastery, where stone walls have witnessed centuries of whispered prayers and silent suffering. Picture yourself walking these shadowed corridors where sunlight filters weakly through narrow windows, casting long fingers of pale light across floors once smooth by countless sandaled feet. The air carries the scent of incense and damp stone, of beeswax candles and ancient parchment, creating an atmosphere so foreign to our modern world that it feels almost otherworldly. Here, in these sacred halls, men devoted their entire lives to a rhythm so demanding, so alien to our contemporary existence, that most of us would struggle to endure even a single day within these walls. As you settle into this journey through time, allow yourself to truly consider what it would mean to surrender every comfort you have ever known, every convenience you take for granted, every moment of personal freedom you cherish. If you find peace in this exploration of a life lived in complete devotion, consider subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of human experience, where we discover together how our ancestors lived, suffered, and found meaning in ways that challenge everything we think we know about endurance and faith. The question that haunts these ancient stones is simple yet profound. Could you, with your modern sensibilities and your need for constant stimulation, your addiction to comfort and your expectation of choice, survive the crushing weight of monastic discipline that began before dawn and ended long after dusk, day after day, year after year, until death finally granted release from this earthly devotion? Whispers in stone an invitation to the cloister. These monastery walls have absorbed more than 8 centuries of human breath, of whispered confessions and muttered prayers, of stifled sobs and gentle sighs of resignation. Every stone seems to pulse with the accumulated weight of countless lives lived in deliberate constraint, where every moment was measured not by personal desire but by divine command. The corridors stretch before you like arteries of discipline, narrow passages that have channeled generations of monks toward the same inevitable destinations: chapel, refectory, cell, scriptorium, garden, and back again in an endless cycle that define not just their days, but their very souls. Walking through these halls today, even as a visitor, you can feel the oppressive weight of structure that governed every breath these men took. The walls themselves seem to whisper of a time when human will was systematically broken down and rebuilt according to principles that valued obedience above comfort, silence above expression, and collective devotion above individual desire. Each footstep echoes with the memory of thousands who walked this same path, their leather sandals creating a rhythm as regular as breathing, as inevitable as prayer. The very architecture speaks of limitation and control, with windows placed too high to offer distraction from the world beyond, doorways sized to humble rather than welcome, and spaces designed to remind the inhabitant constantly of their smallness in the face of divine authority. These were not buildings meant for human comfort, but for human transformation, spaces crafted to strip away every layer of worldly attachment until nothing remained, but pure devotion distilled into its most essential form. Consider for a moment the psychological impact of entering such a place with the knowledge that you would never again make a decision about how to spend your time, what to eat, when to speak, or even how to think about the simplest aspects of daily existence. Every choice had already been made for you by men long dead, codified in rules that treated human preference as a weakness to be overcome rather than a right to be respected. Before dawn, the toll of the bell long before the first pale hint of dawn touches the eastern horizon, while the world beyond these walls still lies wrapped in the deepest embrace of night, the bronze bells hanging in the monastery tower begin their ancient song. The sound cuts through darkness like a blade through flesh, sharp and unforgiving, calling the faithful from whatever brief respite sleep might have offered. This is not the gentle awakening of modern life, with gradual light and comfortable warmth, but a jarring summons that acknowledges no human weakness, no natural rhythm, no bodily need for rest. Picture yourself lying on a thin straw mattress in a cell barely larger than a modern closet, your body aching from the previous day's labour and the hard surface that serves as your bed. The stones beneath you have absorbed centuries of cold, releasing it slowly into your bones until sleep becomes not rest but endurance. When the bells begin their relentless tolling, every fibre of your being rebels against the call to rise, yet rise you must, For hesitation is not merely discouraged but forbidden. Your feet, already chilled from the night air that flows freely through gaps in the stone walls, must find the cold floor and carry you from the meagre warmth of your rough blanket into corridors where your breath forms clouds and your body shivers involuntarily. There is no time for the gradual awakening that modern life affords. No gentle stretching or comfortable preparation for the day ahead. The bell has spoken, and the bell brooks no delay. In the darkness, you join a procession of shadows, figures moving with the mechanical precision of men who have answered this same call thousands of times before. Their movements are economical, purposeful, stripped of any gesture that might suggest personal comfort or individual preference. Each monk flows through the pre-dawn ritual with the fluid automatism of water following a well-worn channel, their bodies shaped by years of identical mornings into instruments of collective devotion. The chapel awaits, its interior so dark that the altar candles seem less like illumination than like distant stars in an infinite void. Here, in this sacred space where warmth is as scarce as personal freedom, you would take your place among the ranks of the faithful, your voice joining the ancient chants that have risen from these stones every morning for centuries. Your body, accustomed to the gentle awakening of modern life, would protest every moment of this harsh transition from sleep to worship, yet protest would be not only futile but sinful. As the first prayers begin, you realize that this moment of pre-dawn devotion is not an aberration, but the foundation upon which the entire day will be built, each subsequent hour layered upon this initial act of submission to a rhythm that acknowledges no human frailty, no personal need, no individual desire for comfort or ease. The weight of silence, the great rule within these walls. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a living presence that wraps around every moment like a second skin, transforming even the simplest human interactions into exercises in restraint and self-denial. Saint Benedict's rule governs not just when you may speak, but how you may think about the very act of communication, turning what modern humans consider a basic right into a carefully rationed privilege that must be earned through demonstrated devotion and absolute necessity. Imagine living in a world where your thoughts must be filtered through layers of religious consideration before they can be expressed, where the simple act of asking for salt at a meal requires not just permission, but justification, where casual conversation is not merely discouraged, but treated as a form of spiritual weakness that threatens the very foundation of monastic life. Every word you might wish to speak must first pass through an internal tribunal that asks not whether you have the right to speak, but whether God would approve of the sound of your voice breaking the sacred silence that he has commanded. The psychology of extended silence reshapes the human mind in ways that modern people can barely comprehend, creating an internal landscape where thoughts echo and re-echo without the release valve of expression, where emotions build and transform in isolation until they become unrecognizable even to their owner. In this environment, communication happens through a complex language of gestures and glances, nods and positioning, creating a shadow vocabulary that allows for basic coordination while maintaining the fiction of complete verbal restraint. Watch the monks as they move through their daily tasks, and you witness a choreography of suppressed humanity, bodies that have learned to convey necessity without revealing personality, hands that can request assistance without expressing preference, eyes that acknowledge presence without suggesting intimacy. Every gesture has been stripped of spontaneity and rebuilt according to principles that value collective harmony above individual expression, creating interactions that feel more like mechanical coordination than human communication. The weight of this silence accumulates over time, pressing down upon the consciousness like sediment settling in still water until the very shape of thought begins to change under its influence. Words that once flowed freely through your mind become suspect, examined and re-examined for their spiritual worthiness, while the natural human impulse towards social connection withers under the constant scrutiny of religious discipline. You begin to understand that in this place, silence is not merely a practice, but a fundamental alteration of human nature itself, a reshaping of the soul, according to principles that treat social interaction as a form of spiritual contamination. The rule makes clear that this silence is not temporary but permanent, not a brief retreat from the world, but a complete renunciation of one of humanity's most basic characteristics. In choosing to enter this life, you would be choosing to surrender not just your voice, but your very identity as a social being, accepting that your thoughts and feelings and observations would remain forever locked within the prison of your own consciousness. Chanting shadows, the liturgy of the hours, as dawn finally breaks over the monastery walls, the rhythm of prayer that began in darkness continues its relentless march through the hours, dividing each day into segments marked not by human need or natural inclination, but by divine command. The liturgy of the hours transforms time itself into an instrument of worship, creating a temporal grid so rigid and demanding that every moment becomes part of an elaborate spiritual exercise designed to eliminate any space for personal choice or individual desire. Matins flows into lauds which gives way to prime, each service blending into the next like links in an unbreakable chain that stretches from one day into the next without pause or variation. The human voice, that instrument of personal expression and individual identity, becomes instead a tool of collective devotion, its unique qualities subsumed into the greater harmony of Gregorian chant that rises from the chapel like incense, beautiful but impersonal, transcendent but somehow inhuman in its perfect uniformity. Picture yourself standing in that chapel 7 times each day, your feet aching from the cold stone floor, your voice growing hoarse from hours of chanting, your mind struggling to maintain focus on prayers that have become as automatic as breathing, but far less natural. The Latin words flow through your mouth without necessarily engaging your consciousness, creating a strange disconnect between the sounds you produce and the thoughts you think, until you begin to feel like a vessel being used for purposes that have little to do with your own spiritual needs or personal relationship with the divine. The beauty of this chanting cannot be denied, for there is something genuinely transcendent about the way individual voices merge into a single expression of devotion that seems to lift the very stones of the building toward heaven. Yet beneath this beauty lies a profound violence against human nature, a systematic suppression of individual spiritual expression in favor of collective conformity that treats personal religious feeling as suspect, even dangerous. Hour after hour, the cycle continues, each service demanding not just your physical presence, but your complete mental submission to rituals that acknowledge no personal variation, no individual interpretation, no private communication with God that does not pass through the filter of institutional approval. Your throat becomes raw, your knees weak from constant standing and kneeling, your eyes strained from reading the same passages by flickering candlelight. Yet the rhythm never slows, never accommodates human frailty, never acknowledges that the body housing your soul might have needs or limitations that deserve consideration. The liturgy of the hours becomes a kind of spiritual water torture, beautiful in its individual moments but crushing in its accumulated weight, wearing away at your sense of personal identity until you begin to lose track of where institutional devotion ends and genuine faith begins. You realize that this system was designed not to enhance your relationship with God, but to replace it entirely with the monastery's relationship with God, making you not a participant in divine worship, but an instrument of institutional devotion. Bread and water, monastic meals, the refectory stands as perhaps the starkest reminder of how completely monastic life rejects the natural human relationship with food and nourishment, transforming what should be moments of comfort and social connection into exercises in systematic deprivation and spiritual discipline. Here, surrounded by long wooden tables worn smooth by centuries of use, you would discover that even the most basic human need for sustenance has been subordinated to principles that treat physical pleasure as inherently corrupting and bodily satisfaction as spiritually dangerous. The meals themselves would shock any modern sensibility, consisting primarily of thin broths made from vegetables past their prime, coarse bread that scrapes the throat and sits heavy in the stomach, and portions so meagre that hunger becomes not an occasional discomfort, but a constant companion that shapes every waking moment. Water, when available, often carries the taste of the cistern and the constant threat of illness, while wine, that traditional comfort of medieval life, appears so rarely and in such small quantities that its presence feels more like mockery than mercy. But the physical deprivation, harsh as it would be for bodies accustomed to modern abundance, pales in comparison to the psychological assault of eating in complete silence while a designated reader drones through passages of scripture that transform mealtime into yet another opportunity for religious instruction. Imagine trying to chew and swallow food that barely qualifies as nourishment while listening to endless recitations about the dangers of gluttony and the spiritual benefits of fasting, your empty stomach contracting with hunger, even as you are reminded that physical satisfaction is the enemy of spiritual progress. The silence during meals creates an atmosphere of tension that would be almost unbearable for someone accustomed to the social aspects of dining, where conversation and shared enjoyment transform simple nutrition into human connection. Instead, you would sit surrounded by dozens of other men, each locked within his own private struggle with hunger and discomfort, unable to share the experience or seek comfort in mutual recognition of your shared suffering. Every bite becomes a meditation on deprivation, every swallow a reminder of how far you have fallen from the world of abundance and choice that once defined your relationship with food. The bread, coarse and often stale, requires effort to chew and creates no pleasure in consumption, serving purely as fuel for a body that is increasingly viewed as an obstacle to spiritual progress rather than a temple deserving care and respect. The contrast between this systematic starvation and the feast days that occasionally break the monotony only makes the regular deprivation more acute, creating a psychological pattern where physical satisfaction becomes associated with spiritual failure and hunger becomes redefined as virtue. You begin to understand that this transformation of eating from pleasure to penance is not accidental but fundamental to the monastic project of breaking down natural human responses and rebuilding them according to principles that treat physical comfort as inherently corrupting. The chill of stone monastic cells, when evening finally brings release from the day's labours and prayers, you would retreat not to comfort but to a cell that represents the ultimate expression of monastic philosophy, applied to the most intimate aspects of human existence. These tiny chambers, barely large enough for a grown man to lie down with arms extended, contain nothing that might suggest personal identity, individual preference, or human comfort, serving instead as concrete manifestations of the monastery's commitment to stripping away every layer of worldly attachment. The walls, constructed of the same cold stone that forms the entire building, seem to absorb warmth rather than retain it, creating an environment where the chill penetrates not just your clothing but your very bones, making sleep a battle against elements that show no mercy for human frailty. There are no decorations to please the eye, no personal possessions to comfort the spirit, no individual touches that might suggest that this space belongs to anyone in particular rather than simply housing whoever happens to occupy it temporarily. Your bed consists of a wooden frame supporting a thin straw mattress that provides minimal cushioning against the hard surface beneath, covered by rough blankets that offer little protection against the cold that rises from the stone floor and seeps through gaps in the walls. The straw, compressed by use and age, creates lumps and valleys that ensure that no position remains comfortable for long, turning what should be restorative sleep into another form of physical penance that continues even in unconsciousness. Privacy, that fundamental human need that modern people take for granted, simply does not exist within these walls, where individual cells are separated by partitions so thin that every movement, every breath, every sign of human presence becomes audible to neighbours who are themselves struggling with the same deprivations and discomforts. The knowledge that your every sound is monitored, your every moment of weakness potentially observed, adds a layer of psychological pressure to the physical discomfort that makes genuine rest nearly impossible. In this tiny space, you would confront the full weight of your decision to abandon the world, for it is here, in the long hours of darkness when prayer and labour no longer distract from the harsh realities of monastic existence, that the true cost of this life becomes clear. The cell serves as both sanctuary and prison, offering escape from the demands of community life while trapping you within the confines of your own increasingly isolated consciousness. The simplicity that monastic philosophy presents as virtue reveals itself in these moments as profound deprivation, stripping away not just unnecessary luxuries, but basic human comforts that serve legitimate psychological and physical needs. You begin to understand that the cell is designed not to provide rest, but to ensure that even sleep becomes part of the monastic discipline. Another opportunity to demonstrate submission to principles that treat human comfort as spiritual weakness. Hands to work labour for the soul as the sun climbs higher over the monastery walls. The time comes to engage in the manual labour that forms the backbone of monastic existence, where physical work becomes not merely necessary for survival, but a fundamental component of spiritual discipline designed to exhaust the body and humble the spirit. Here, in fields and workshops and kitchens that smell of sweat and earth and endless toil, you would discover that even productive activity has been transformed into an instrument of religious control that treats human creativity and individual skill as potential sources of pride that must be carefully managed. The work itself varies with the seasons and the needs of the community, from the back-breaking labour of harvest time, when grain must be cut and gathered under the merciless sun, to the delicate task of copying manuscripts in dim scriptoriums where eyes strain and fingers cramp from hours of precise work, to the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and maintaining that keeps any human community functioning, but which here carries the additional burden of being performed as an act of worship rather than simple necessity. Your hands, perhaps once soft from modern convenience, would quickly develop calluses and scars from tools that show no mercy for inexperience, while your back would learn the particular ache that comes from bending over crops or hunching over parchment for hours without relief. The rhythm of monastic work acknowledges no personal limitation, no individual pace, no accommodation for the natural variations in human strength and endurance that characterize normal labour relationships. In the fields, you would work alongside brothers whose silence transforms shared labour from the social activity. It naturally becomes into a form of isolation that makes the physical demands even more psychologically challenging. There is no conversation to distract from aching muscles, no shared jokes to lighten the burden of repetitive tasks, no human connection to transform work from mere drudgery into meaningful cooperation between individuals working toward common goals. The monastery's commitment to self-sufficiency means that every aspect of daily life requires constant labour, from growing and preparing food to maintaining buildings that seem to crumble as quickly as they can be repaired, to producing the goods that provide the community's only source of income from the outside world. You become part of an economic machine that operates according to principles that place spiritual discipline above efficiency, community harmony above individual expertise, and religious obedience above practical results. The irony of monastic labour reveals itself gradually as you realise that this work, presented as humble service to God, actually serves primarily to exhaust the body and occupy the mind so completely that genuine spiritual reflection becomes nearly impossible. The endless cycle of physical demands ensures that whatever energy might have been directed toward personal spiritual growth or individual religious contemplation is instead channeled into maintaining the institutional structure that claims to facilitate such growth, while actually preventing it through systematic physical and mental exhaustion. Illuminated patience, the scriptorium. In the scriptorium, that hushed chamber where knowledge is preserved through the agonizing process of manual reproduction, you would encounter perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of monastic life, where intellectual activity becomes subordinated to principles that treat human creativity and individual interpretation as dangerous departures from institutional orthodoxy. Here, surrounded by the tools of learning and scholarship, you would discover that even the life of the mind has been carefully circumscribed according to rules that permit no deviation from established patterns of thought and expression. The work of copying manuscripts requires a level of physical precision and mental concentration that would challenge even those accustomed to detailed intellectual labour. As every letter must be formed with careful attention to established models, every word checked and double-checked against approved texts, every decorative element executed according to traditions that leave no room for individual artistic expression or creative interpretation. Your eyes would strain in the dim light that filters through small windows, supplemented by candles that create more shadows than illumination, while your hand cramps from gripping the quill with the precise pressure required to create letters that meet the exacting standards of monastic scribal tradition. The silence in the scriptorium carries a different quality from the silence elsewhere in the monastery. weighted with the accumulated pressure of centuries of intellectual work performed under conditions that treat scholarship not as exploration, but as reproduction, learning not as discovery, but as transmission, creativity not as divine gift, but as human weakness that threatens the purity of received wisdom. Every text you copy has been approved by authorities who have determined not just its spiritual worthiness, but its absolute correctness, leaving no space for the kind of questioning or interpretation that characterizes genuine intellectual engagement. Hour after hour, day after day, you would bend over parchment that represents not just writing material, but the physical manifestation of institutional control over human thought, reproducing texts that embody not just religious truth, but political and social orthodoxy that admits no questioning, no development, no personal insight that might challenge established interpretations. The beauty of illuminated manuscripts, with their gold leaf and intricate designs, masks the violence done to human creativity in their production, as every decorative element must conform to patterns that eliminate personal style in favour of institutional uniformity. The physical demands of scribal work compound its psychological challenges, as the precise motor control required for hours of detailed writing creates a constant low, level pain that radiates through hand and wrist and arm, while the concentration required to avoid errors generates a mental fatigue that makes genuine engagement with the content nearly impossible. You begin to understand that the scriptorium serves not to preserve and transmit knowledge, but to transform human beings into copying machines that reproduce information without understanding it, maintaining the illusion of scholarship while eliminating its essential characteristics of questioning and interpretation. The irony becomes clear as you realize that this work, presented as the highest form of intellectual devotion, actually represents the systematic destruction of everything that makes intellectual work meaningful, reducing human consciousness to a tool for institutional reproduction that serves the monastery's needs while starving the individual mind of the very engagement and growth that should characterize genuine spiritual and intellectual development. Discipline and devotion. The monastic order, within the carefully structured hierarchy of monastic life, you would quickly discover that every human relationship has been transformed into an expression of institutional power that treats individual personality, personal preference, and natural social inclinations as obstacles to be overcome rather than gifts to be celebrated. The chain of command that stretches from abbot through prior to simple monk creates a system of authority so absolute and unquestioning that it reduces grown men to the status of children whose every action requires permission and whose every thought must conform to patterns established by those higher in the religious hierarchy. The abbot, that figure who combines spiritual authority with temporal power, represents not just religious leadership but complete control over every aspect of daily existence. From the food you eat to the words you speak to the thoughts you are permitted to think about your own spiritual development. His word carries the weight of divine command, and questioning his decisions becomes not just insubordination but heresy, creating a psychological environment where critical thinking and personal judgment are treated as forms of spiritual pride that threaten the very foundation of monastic life. Obedience, elevated to the status of supreme virtue, requires not just compliance with explicit commands, but the complete surrender of individual will and personal judgment, creating a state of psychological dependence that transforms adult human beings into instruments of institutional purpose rather than autonomous spiritual seekers. You would learn to anticipate commands before they are given, to suppress questions before they form, to eliminate preferences and opinions and personal reactions that might suggest any remaining attachment to individual identity. The system of discipline that enforces this obedience operates through a combination of public humiliation and private penance that ensures conformity through fear, while maintaining the fiction that all suffering is voluntary and spiritually beneficial. Minor infractions result in public confession and ritualized self-abasement, while more serious departures from absolute conformity can lead to isolation, increased labor, or physical punishment that is presented as correction rather than cruelty. You begin to understand that the monastic order serves not to facilitate individual spiritual growth, but to eliminate individuality itself, creating human beings so thoroughly conditioned to institutional authority that they become incapable of independent spiritual or intellectual development. The devotion that is demanded is not love of God, but love of the system that claims to represent God, and the discipline that is practiced serves not to strengthen character, but to destroy the capacity for character development that might threaten institutional control. The psychological impact of this systematic destruction of personal autonomy reveals itself gradually as you realize that the monastery succeeds not by making better human beings, but by making fewer human beings, reducing complex individuals to simple components in a machine designed to perpetuate itself rather than serve any genuine spiritual purpose that might benefit the souls it claims to nurture and protect. The infirmary, when the body weakens in the monastery's infirmary, that chamber where human frailty meets medieval medical knowledge, you would confront the terrifying reality of illness and injury in a world where healing depends more on prayer than knowledge, more on endurance than treatment, and more on accepting suffering as divine than on alleviating pain through human intervention. Here, surrounded by the groans of the sick and the smell of herbal remedies that often do more harm than good, you would discover that even physical suffering has been incorporated into the monastic system as another opportunity for spiritual discipline and submission to divine authority. The treatments available would seem primitive beyond belief to someone accustomed to modern medical care, consisting primarily of bloodletting and purging that weaken already compromised bodies. Herbal concoctions based more on tradition than understanding, and prayer sessions that substitute hope for actual intervention. A simple infection that modern antibiotics could cure in days might linger for weeks or months, slowly consuming your strength, while the monastic community treats your suffering as evidence of spiritual testing rather than medical emergency requiring aggressive treatment. The psychological impact of illness in this environment extends far beyond physical discomfort, as the monastery's interpretation of suffering as divine punishment for spiritual inadequacy transforms sickness from misfortune into evidence of moral failure. Your fever becomes proof of insufficient devotion, your pain evidence of hidden sin, your weakness demonstration that you have not yet achieved the level of spiritual purification required for true monastic life. The community's response to your illness focuses not on comfort and care, but on prayer and penance designed to address the spiritual causes they believe underlie your physical symptoms. The infirmary itself reflects the monastery's approach to human need, providing minimal comfort and basic shelter, while maintaining the fiction that physical suffering serves spiritual purposes that justify inadequate care. The beds offer little more cushioning than those in regular cells. The food remains as meagre and unappetizing as ever, and the silence continues to prevail even among the sick, preventing the kind of human connection and mutual support that might ease the psychological burden of illness and pain. You would lie in that dim chamber, listening to the laboured breathing of other sufferers, feeling your own strength ebb, while treatments that often worsen rather than improve your condition are administered with the confidence of ignorance disguised as faith. The knowledge that recovery depends more on luck than skill, more on natural healing than medical intervention, adds a layer of existential terror to physical suffering that modern patients rarely experience. The monastery's approach to terminal illness reveals the ultimate inadequacy of their system, as dying brothers are encouraged to see their approaching death as spiritual victory rather than human tragedy, while the community prepares to replace them as quickly as possible rather than mourning the loss of irreplaceable individuals whose lives and experiences and personalities will vanish forever when their bodies finally succumb to illnesses that proper medical knowledge might have prevented or cured. The cloistered garden silence among nature in the monastery garden, that carefully cultivated space where nature has been disciplined and ordered according to the same principles that govern human life within these walls, you would discover one of the few areas where monastic existence approaches something resembling beauty and peace. Yet even here the natural world has been subordinated to institutional purposes that transform what should be a source of joy and renewal into another instrument of spiritual discipline and practical necessity. The garden itself reflects the monastic aesthetic of useful beauty, where every plant serves either medicinal or nutritional purposes, where decorative elements exist only to serve symbolic functions that reinforce religious teaching, and where the natural abundance and wildness that characterize healthy ecosystems have been replaced by rigid rows and careful spacing that mirror the ordered lives of the men who tend them. You would work among herbs whose properties are understood through tradition rather than science, vegetables whose varieties have been selected for hardiness rather than flavor, and fruit trees whose productivity matters more than the simple pleasure their blossoms might provide to souls starved for beauty. The silence that governs garden work transforms what should be collaborative labor into isolated drudgery, preventing the kind of shared knowledge and mutual assistance that characterizes healthy agricultural communities. You would dig and plant and weed in solitude, unable to share observations about soil conditions or plant health, unable to seek advice about techniques or timing, unable to express the simple satisfaction that comes from watching seeds develop into mature plants that will sustain human life. The seasonal rhythms that govern garden work provide one of the few remaining connections to natural cycles that the monastery has not completely subordinated to artificial religious scheduling. Yet even these patterns are interpreted through theological lenses that treat natural processes as moral lessons rather than biological realities, deserving understanding and respect. Spring planting becomes a meditation on spiritual renewal, summer growth an opportunity to reflect on divine providence, autumn harvest a reminder of final judgment, and winter dormancy a call to increased prayer and penance. The physical demands of garden labor, combined with the inadequate nutrition that characterizes monastic life, would gradually wear down your body's capacity to perform the work required to maintain the very crops that provide your insufficient sustenance. Your hands would crack from constant exposure to soil and weather. Your back would ache from bending and lifting and carrying. Your skin would burn from sun exposure that proper clothing might prevent, but which the monastery treats as acceptable hardship rather than preventable suffering. Yet, despite these hardships, the garden remains the one place where something approaching natural beauty persists within the monastery walls, where the cycles of growth and death and renewal continue according to patterns older than human civilization, offering brief glimpses of the world that exists beyond institutional control and suggesting possibilities for human life that transcend the narrow confines of monastic discipline and artificial spiritual development. The burden of obedience trials of the spirit as months turn to years within these unforgiving walls. The accumulated weight of absolute obedience begins to reshape not just behavior but consciousness itself, creating psychological changes so profound that the person who entered the monastery gradually disappears, replaced by a hollow vessel that responds to institutional commands with mechanical precision while losing the capacity for genuine spiritual experience or personal growth that supposedly justified this radical submission in the first place. The constant suppression of individual judgment and personal preference creates a form of learned helplessness that extends far beyond monastic rules into every aspect of mental and emotional life, until you find yourself unable to make even the simplest decisions without seeking permission from authority figures who treat your dependency as evidence of spiritual progress rather than psychological damage. Your capacity for independent thought withers under the constant scrutiny of superiors who interpret any sign of intellectual curiosity or emotional authenticity as dangerous pride that threatens the stability of the community and your own spiritual development. The isolation created by enforced silence compounds the psychological pressure of absolute obedience, preventing the kind of human connection and mutual support that might help you process the emotional and spiritual challenges of this radically constrained existence. You become trapped within your own consciousness, unable to share doubts or fears or questions with fellow sufferers who might offer perspective or comfort, forced to wrestle alone with psychological and spiritual crises that communal wisdom might help resolve. The monastery's interpretation of spiritual struggle as evidence of insufficient devotion rather than natural human response to unnatural conditions creates additional layers of guilt and self-doubt that make psychological healing nearly impossible. Your depression becomes proof of spiritual inadequacy, your anxiety evidence of insufficient faith, your longing for human connection demonstration that you have not yet achieved the level of detachment required for true monastic life. The system of confession and penance that supposedly provides outlet for psychological pressure actually increases it by treating normal human emotions and natural responses to deprivation as sins requiring correction, rather than signals deserving attention and care. You learn to hide your suffering rather than address it, to suppress your needs rather than meet them, to interpret your own psychological distress as moral failure rather than reasonable response to unreasonable conditions. The gradual erosion of personality and individual identity that results from this systematic psychological pressure represents perhaps the greatest tragedy of monastic life, as human beings created for growth and development and relationship are transformed into institutional components that serve organizational purposes while losing the very qualities that make them capable of genuine spiritual experience or meaningful connection with the divine they supposedly serve with such dedication and sacrifice. Nightfall in the monastery returned to silence, as darkness once again claims the monastery, and the final bells of the day call the faithful to their last communal prayers. You would join the procession of exhausted figures moving through corridors that have witnessed this same ritual for centuries, their footsteps creating a rhythm as regular and inevitable as breathing, as mechanical and dispiriting as the institutional machinery that governs every moment of their existence from dawn until dusk and beyond. The chapel, lit now by candles that cast dancing shadows on walls that have absorbed countless prayers and witnessed untold suffering, becomes the final stage for a day that began in darkness and returns to darkness with nothing but repetition and endurance to mark the passage of time between morning and evening devotions. Your voice, hoarse from hours of chanting and weakened by inadequate nutrition, joins the collective recitation of prayers that have lost whatever meaning they once held through endless repetition performed under conditions of physical and psychological duress. The faces around you, illuminated briefly by flickering candlelight before disappearing again into shadow, reflect the same exhaustion and resignation that you feel in your own bones. Yet the system allows no acknowledgement of shared suffering, no moment of human connection that might ease the burden of individual struggle through recognition that others face the same challenges and experience the same doubts and fears that you carry alone through each difficult day. The final prayers of Compline carry a haunting quality that speaks more of defeat than victory, more of endurance than triumph, as voices worn thin by deprivation and discipline struggle to maintain the rhythm and pitch required by liturgical tradition, while bodies weakened by inadequate food and excessive labour sway with fatigue that goes unacknowledged and unrelieved by any concession to human limitation or need. As the service concludes and the community disperses in silence towards cells that offer no comfort and rest that brings no restoration, you realise that this ending is not conclusion but pause, a brief interruption in a cycle that will resume before dawn with the same demands, the same deprivations, the same systematic erosion of human dignity and individual worth that characterises every aspect of monastic existence. The darkness that settles over the monastery carries with it the weight of all the days that came before, and all the identical days that stretch ahead, creating a psychological landscape where time loses meaning, because nothing changes, nothing improves, nothing offers hope for development or growth, or the kind of spiritual progress that supposedly justifies the enormous sacrifice demanded of those who choose this path toward what they believe will be closer communion with divine truth and eternal salvation. Why you would not endure the final reflection now, as you imagine yourself walking back through those heavy wooden doors into the modern world with its abundance and choices and freedoms that you have always taken for granted. The full weight of what you have witnessed begins to settle into your consciousness like sediment in still water, revealing truths about human nature and spiritual development that challenge everything our contemporary cult teaches about the relationship between suffering and growth, between deprivation and holiness, between institutional control and personal salvation. The harsh reality that emerges from this journey through medieval monastic life is not that such extreme discipline produces superior human beings or facilitates genuine spiritual development, but rather that it systematically destroys the very qualities that make spiritual growth possible, reducing complex individuals to institutional components while claiming to elevate them to higher levels of divine communion and religious understanding. The monastery succeeds not by creating saints but by breaking human spirits so thoroughly that resistance becomes impossible and conformity appears to be devotion. your modern sensibilities, shaped by concepts of individual rights and personal autonomy that medieval people never imagined, would rebel against every aspect of this existence from the moment you first heard those pre-dawn bells until the final prayers released you to sleepless nights in cells designed more for punishment than rest, the food that barely sustains life, the silence that prevents human connection, the obedience that eliminates personal judgment, the labor that exhausts without fulfilling, the discipline that breaks rather than builds character. All of these elements combine to create a system so fundamentally hostile to human flourishing that enduring it requires not spiritual strength, but psychological damage. The monastery's greatest deception lies in its claim that such systematic deprivation serves divine purposes, when it actually serves only institutional purposes, maintaining a structure that benefits from human submission while providing nothing in return except the illusion of spiritual progress measured by the very suffering it creates. The men who survive this system do so not because they become better human beings, but because they become less human, sacrificing the qualities of curiosity and creativity and emotional authenticity that might allow them to question whether their sacrifice serves any purpose beyond perpetuating the institution that demands it. Yet even as we recognize the fundamental cruelty and spiritual emptiness of such extreme institutional control, something in the human spirit responds to the ideal of complete devotion, of surrender so total that individual will disappears into something larger than personal desire. The tragedy of monastic life lies not in its aspiration toward transcendence, but in its systematic destruction of the very human qualities that make transcendence possible, creating the appearance of holiness while eliminating the authentic spiritual development that might justify such enormous personal sacrifice. As you return to your comfortable bed and varied food and freedom to speak and think and choose how to spend your time, you carry with you a deeper appreciation for the gifts of modern existence and a soberer understanding of the price that previous generations paid for religious certainty in a world where institutional authority claimed absolute power over individual conscience and personal spiritual development. The monastery walls may whisper of devotion and sacrifice, but they also speak of human suffering that served no divine purpose and human potential destroyed in service of systems that confused control with spirituality and mistook submission for salvation. In the end, you would not endure such a life not because you lack spiritual commitment or religious devotion, but because you recognize that true spiritual development requires the very freedom and individual dignity that monastic life systematically destroys, and because you understand that any God worthy of worship would never demand the complete destruction of human personality and individual consciousness as the price of divine favor or eternal salvation. The psychology of perpetual hunger, beyond the immediate physical discomfort of insufficient nutrition, lies a more insidious transformation that occurs when the human body and mind adapt to chronic deprivation, creating psychological changes that extend far beyond simple appetite into realms of consciousness and perception that modern people can barely comprehend. In the monastery, hunger becomes not merely an occasional inconvenience, but a constant companion that shapes every thought, influences every emotion, and colors every experience with the grey tinge of perpetual, one that gradually rewrites the fundamental programming of human consciousness. The body's response to sustained malnutrition creates a cascade of physiological changes that affect not just physical strength, but mental clarity, emotional stability, and spiritual capacity in ways that the monastery's spiritual directors either fail to understand or deliberately ignore in their pursuit of what they believe to be purification through suffering. Your metabolism slows to conserve energy, creating a persistent lethargy that makes every task more difficult, while the institutional schedule demands unchanged levels of performance and devotion regardless of your body's diminished capacity to meet those demands. The psychological impact of chronic hunger reveals itself through subtle but profound alterations in thought patterns and emotional responses that gradually reshape personality itself, as the constant awareness of physical need creates a mental preoccupation that crowds out other forms of consciousness and makes genuine spiritual contemplation nearly impossible. Your thoughts begin to revolve around food with an intensity that becomes almost obsessive, Yet expressing this preoccupation violates the monastery's spiritual principles and demonstrates what authorities interpret as insufficient detachment from worldly concerns. The social dynamics of shared deprivation create additional psychological pressures as you become acutely aware of every morsel consumed by others, every slight variation in portion size, every moment when someone might receive marginally better treatment in terms of nutrition or comfort. The enforced silence prevents any discussion of these observations, creating internal tensions that build without outlet, while the community maintains the fiction that such material concerns have been transcended through spiritual discipline. The cognitive effects of malnutrition compound these psychological challenges as your ability to concentrate diminishes, your memory becomes less reliable, and your capacity for complex thought deteriorates under the influence of a brain that lacks the nutritional resources necessary for optimal function. The lengthy prayers and complex theological concepts that form the foundation of monastic intellectual life become increasingly difficult to grasp and retain. Yet the institutional response to these difficulties involves not improved nutrition, but increased spiritual discipline and more intensive prayer. Your relationship with your own body transforms under these conditions as you learn to ignore physical signals that evolved to protect human health and survival, treating hunger pangs as spiritual opportunities rather than biological necessities, and interpreting your body's distress signals as evidence of progress in overcoming attachment to material existence rather than warnings that your health and well-being require attention and care. The long-term effects of sustained malnutrition during the medieval period often resulted in permanent damage to physical and mental development, creating monks who survived the rigors of monastic life, but emerged from the experience as diminished versions of their potential selves, their bodies stunted and their minds clouded by years of inadequate nutrition during periods when proper nourishment might have supported continued growth and development. The monastery's theological justification for this systematic starvation relies on interpretations of scripture that emphasize the corruption of flesh and the necessity of subduing bodily desires. Yet these interpretations conveniently ignore other scriptural passages that celebrate the body as divine creation and recognize proper care for physical needs as legitimate stewardship of gifts entrusted to human care rather than obstacles to spiritual development. The erosion of identity through uniform existence within the monastery walls, the systematic elimination of individual identity proceeds through countless small surrenders that accumulate over time like drops of water wearing away stone, until the person who entered seeking spiritual growth disappears entirely, replaced by an institutional creation that serves organizational purposes while losing all connection to the unique gifts and perspectives that once defined their individual contribution to human community and spiritual understanding. The process begins with the most obvious markers of personal identity, your name replaced by a religious designation that erases family connections and personal history, your clothing exchanged for identical robes that eliminate any expression of individual taste or cultural background, your personal possessions surrendered to demonstrate detachment from material concerns, while actually serving to increase dependence on institutional provision and approval for even the most basic necessities of daily existence. But these external changes represent only the visible manifestation of a much deeper psychological transformation that occurs as the monastery systematically eliminates every opportunity for individual choice, personal preference, or autonomous decision, making that might allow you to maintain connection to your unique personality and individual perspective on spiritual and practical matters. Every moment of your day becomes predetermined by rules established by others, every response to circumstances dictated by precedent rather than personal judgment, every interaction governed by protocols that treat individual variation as dangerous deviation from collective harmony. The gradual disappearance of personal agency creates a form of psychological dependency that extends far beyond practical matters into the realm of spiritual and intellectual development, as you lose not just the ability to make decisions, but the capacity to recognize when decisions need to be made or to trust your own judgment about matters that require individual discernment and personal spiritual insight. Your thoughts themselves become subject to institutional regulation as the monastery's spiritual directors monitor not just your behavior, but your internal responses to circumstances, treating any sign of independent thinking or personal spiritual insight as potential pride or disobedience that threatens the stability of the community and your own progress toward the kind of spiritual death they mistake for spiritual growth and development. The enforced silence eliminates the social feedback that normally helps individuals maintain their sense of personal identity through interaction with others who recognize and respond to their unique characteristics and perspectives. Without the mirror of social recognition and response, your sense of self begins to fade like a photograph exposed to sunlight, becoming increasingly indistinct until you can no longer remember what made you different from anyone else, or why those differences might have been valuable rather than obstacles to overcome. The monastery's schedule eliminates the natural rhythms of individual energy and attention that allow people to develop and express their unique gifts and talents in ways that contribute to community well-being while maintaining personal fulfillment and growth. Instead of working with your natural patterns of alertness and creativity, the institutional schedule treats all individuals as identical units requiring identical treatment regardless of their different capacities, interests, or potential contributions to spiritual and practical community life. The psychological impact of this systematic identity erosion reveals itself through the gradual disappearance of curiosity, creativity, and emotional authenticity that once characterized your individual approach to spiritual and intellectual questions. You stop asking personal questions about theological matters because the monastery provides predetermined answers that admit no individual interpretation or development, and you stop feeling authentic emotions about spiritual experiences because the institution defines proper responses that eliminate personal variation in favor of collective conformity. The architecture of control, every element of monastic architecture serves the dual purpose of practical necessity and psychological manipulation, creating physical spaces that reinforce the institutional goals of control and submission, while maintaining the appearance of serving spiritual purposes that justify their harsh impact on human comfort and psychological well-being. The buildings themselves become instruments of indoctrination, their very design communicating messages about human worth, individual identity, and proper relationship to authority that penetrate consciousness through constant environmental pressure rather than explicit instruction. The narrow corridors that connect different areas of the monastery create a sense of constriction and limitation that mirrors the psychological constraints imposed on individual freedom and personal choice, while their length and uniformity disorient visitors and residents alike, making navigation dependent on learned patterns rather than intuitive understanding of spatial relationships. You would find yourself moving through these passages with the mechanical precision of someone following predetermined routes rather than making conscious choices about where to go and how to get there. The low ceilings that characterize most monastic buildings create an oppressive atmosphere that literally forces inhabitants to maintain postures of humility while limiting the sense of expansiveness and possibility that higher ceilings might provide, contributing to psychological states that mirror the spiritual submission demanded by institutional authorities. The constant awareness of physical limitation overhead translates into mental acceptance of limitations on thought and aspiration that serve institutional rather than individual spiritual purposes. The windows, positioned high in the walls and sized to admit minimal light, serve not just to reduce distractions from the outside world, but to create an environment where natural illumination never fully dispels the sense of enclosure and separation from the broader human community beyond the monastery walls. The dim lighting throughout most of the complex creates eye strain and visual fatigue that compound the physical exhaustion from inadequate nutrition and excessive labor, while the artificial scarcity of light makes even simple tasks more difficult and time-consuming. The stone construction that characterizes monastic architecture creates thermal conditions that prioritize durability over human comfort, resulting in spaces that remain cold during winter months and provide little relief during summer heat, ensuring that physical discomfort becomes a constant background presence that shapes every activity and interaction within the community. The thermal mass of stone walls and floors absorbs and radiates cold in ways that make adequate heating nearly impossible with medieval technology, while their impermeability to air circulation creates stuffiness and poor air quality that affect both physical health and mental clarity. The acoustic properties of stone construction create an environment where every sound echoes and reverberates in ways that eliminate privacy while amplifying the impact of bells and chanting that serve to regulate institutional life according to predetermined schedules. The hard surfaces reflect sound rather than absorbing it, creating an auditory landscape where whispered conversations carry farther than intended, while the constant background noise of institutional life makes genuine quiet nearly impossible to achieve even during designated periods of silence. The spatial organization of monastic buildings reflects and reinforces hierarchical relationships within the community, with areas designated for different ranks and functions arranged to ensure that movement through the complex constantly reminds inhabitants of their position within the institutional structure and their dependence on higher authorities for access to basic necessities like food, shelter, and spiritual guidance. The absence of personal spaces within the monastic design eliminates the psychological benefits of territory and privacy that contribute to individual well-being and personal development, creating an environment where inhabitants can never escape institutional oversight or find refuge from the constant pressure of communal existence governed by rules that admit no individual variation or personal need for solitude and reflection. The corruption of learning within the monastery's scriptorium and library, the noble pursuit of knowledge and learning suffers a systematic corruption that transforms intellectual activity from exploration and discovery into mere reproduction and institutional propaganda, creating scholars who possess technical skills without understanding, monks who can copy texts without comprehending them, and a system of education that produces ignorance disguised as wisdom, while claiming to preserve and transmit the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. The selection of texts deemed worthy of copying and preservation reflects not the intrinsic value of ideas or the quality of intellectual content, but the degree to which written material supports existing institutional authority and reinforces predetermined theological conclusions but admit no questioning or development through genuine scholarly inquiry. Works that might challenge institutional orthodoxy or encourage independent thinking disappear from consideration, while texts that support established power structures receive endless reproduction, regardless of their intellectual merit or spiritual authenticity. The process of copying itself becomes divorced from comprehension as scribes focus on mechanical accuracy rather than intellectual engagement with the material they reproduce, creating a form of literacy that serves institutional purposes while eliminating the critical thinking and analytical skills that characterize genuine education and scholarly development. You would spend hours reproducing arguments and ideas without understanding their logical structure, their historical context, or their relationship to other intellectual traditions that might provide perspective and balance. The enforced silence in the scriptorium prevents the kind of discussion and debate that transforms mere information into genuine knowledge through the testing of ideas against alternative perspectives and the development of understanding through social interaction with others who bring different insights and questions to shared intellectual challenges. The isolation of individual scholars eliminates the collaborative aspects of learning that have historically driven intellectual progress and innovation. The monastery's approach to controversial or complex theological questions eliminates the uncertainty and questioning that drive genuine intellectual development, providing predetermined answers that must be accepted without examination rather than encouraging the kind of rigorous analysis and debate that might lead to deeper understanding or new insights into spiritual and philosophical matters. The physical conditions in the scriptorium, inadequate lighting, uncomfortable seating, poor air quality, and temperature extremes, create an environment where intellectual work becomes associated with physical suffering rather than joy and discovery, teaching scribes to endure rather than enjoy their scholarly activities while reducing their capacity for sustained concentration and creative thinking. The reward system within monastic scholarly communities reinforces conformity rather than innovation, recognizing technical skill and institutional loyalty while discouraging original thinking or creative interpretation that might advance human understanding but threaten established authorities who depend on intellectual stagnation to maintain their control over institutional life and spiritual direction. The long-term impact of this corrupted approach to learning reveals itself in the gradual decline of intellectual capacity within monastic communities, as generations of scholars train to reproduce rather than think create an environment where genuine knowledge disappears, even as the appearance of learning continues through the mechanical preservation of texts, whose meaning has been lost along with the intellectual traditions that created them. The seasonal cycle of despair. The passage of seasons within the monastery walls creates a rhythm of suffering that intensifies the psychological challenges of monastic life through the systematic elimination of natural human responses to environmental change and the seasonal variations in mood and energy that characterize healthy human adaptation to cyclical patterns of light, temperature, and natural abundance that have shaped human consciousness throughout evolutionary history. Winter arrives like a judgment, bringing cold that penetrates the inadequate heating systems of medieval architecture and settles into bones already weakened by malnutrition and excessive labor, creating levels of physical discomfort that compound the psychological pressures of institutional life, while the community maintains its inflexible schedule of prayer and work regardless of weather conditions that would normally prompt adjustments in human activity patterns. The shortened days of winter reduce the already inadequate natural lighting within monastery buildings, creating an environment of perpetual twilight that affects not just practical activities but psychological states as well, contributing to forms of depression and mental fatigue that the monastery's spiritual directors interpret as spiritual challenges rather than natural responses to environmental conditions that require accommodation rather than resistance through increased discipline and prayer. The agricultural demands of spring and summer create periods of intensified labor that exhaust bodies already compromised by inadequate nutrition and poor living conditions, while the monastery's commitment to self-sufficiency demands levels of productivity that ignore individual capacity and health considerations in favor of collective goals that serve institutional rather than personal needs for sustainable work patterns and adequate rest. The harvest season brings brief abundance that serves primarily to highlight the systematic deprivation that characterizes most of the year, creating psychological tension between natural human responses to plenty and institutional demands for continued austerity and self-denial, even when resources become temporarily adequate to support improved nutrition and comfort that might restore health and energy for continued spiritual and physical development. The cyclical nature of seasonal challenges creates a psychological pattern where brief periods of relative improvement alternate with extended periods of increased hardship, preventing the kind of sustained well-being that might allow for genuine spiritual growth, while maintaining hope just enough to prevent complete despair, but never enough to support actual flourishing or development. The monastery's interpretation of seasonal challenges as spiritual opportunities eliminates the natural human tendency to adapt to environmental changes through practical adjustments in clothing, diet, activity levels, and social patterns that have historically allowed human communities to thrive in various climatic conditions rather than merely surviving them through stoic endurance. The isolation from family and community celebrations that mark seasonal transitions in the broader culture creates additional psychological pressure during periods when natural human inclinations toward festivity and social connection become most acute, forcing monks to suppress not just personal desires but deep-seated cultural and biological patterns that connect individual well-being to community celebration and shared joy. The accumulation of seasonal hardships over multiple years creates a form of chronic stress that affects not just immediate well-being but long-term physical and mental health, as bodies and minds adapted to cyclical patterns of challenge and recovery instead face unrelenting pressure that allows no adequate rest or restoration between periods of environmental difficulty. The violence of forced brotherhood. The monastery's ideal of fraternal community masks a reality of forced association that eliminates the natural human processes of friendship formation and social bonding, creating artificial relationships based on institutional proximity rather than genuine affinity, while claiming to represent higher forms of love and spiritual connection that transcend the limitations of worldly friendship and personal preference in social relationships. The elimination of choice in social relationships creates psychological tensions that would be barely tolerable even among compatible personalities, but become sources of constant stress when individuals with conflicting temperaments, different backgrounds, or incompatible approaches to spiritual and practical matters are forced into intimate daily contact without the option of limiting interaction or seeking alternative companionship based on mutual interest and genuine affection. The enforced silence that governs most monastic interaction prevents the development of understanding and empathy that normally allows people to work through personality conflicts and cultural differences through communication and negotiation. Forcing monks to coexist with individuals they might naturally avoid while having no mechanism for addressing tensions or resolving conflicts that develop from such unnatural forced association. The monastery's hierarchical structure complicates artificial brotherhood by overlaying relationships of authority and submission onto what should be peer interactions, creating situations where personal dislike or ideological disagreement cannot be expressed or addressed through normal social processes, but must be suppressed in favor of institutional harmony that serves organizational rather than individual psychological and spiritual needs. The absence of privacy eliminates the psychological refuge that allows individuals to process social stress and maintain emotional equilibrium when dealing with difficult interpersonal situations, forcing monks to remain constantly engaged with community dynamics that may be psychologically harmful, while having no opportunity for the solitude and reflection that might allow them to develop healthy coping strategies or find peace within challenging social environments. The institutional pressure to demonstrate love and acceptance toward all community members regardless of personal feelings creates a form of emotional dishonesty that corrupts genuine spiritual development by requiring the suppressors in favor of artificial displays of affection that serve institutional goals while preventing the kind of honest self-examination and emotional growth that characterize growth that honors healthy external development. The monastery's interpretation of social conflict as spiritual failure eliminates the possibility of addressing legitimate interpersonal problems through normal human mechanisms of communication, compromise, and boundary setting, instead treating personality clashes and cultural differences as evidence of insufficient spiritual development that requires increased discipline rather than practical solutions that might actually resolve underlying tensions. The long-term psychological impact of forced brotherhood reveals itself through the development of social skills and emotional patterns that serve institutional survival rather than healthy human relationship, creating individuals who learn to suppress authentic responses and maintain artificial harmony while losing the capacity for genuine intimacy and mutual understanding that characterize healthy human social development. The perversion of sacred time. The monastery's rigid schedule transforms time itself from a natural flow that allows for human rhythms of energy and attention into an artificial construct that serves institutional rather than personal or spiritual needs, creating a temporal environment where every moment becomes subject to external control while eliminating the freedom to respond authentically to internal spiritual promptings or natural cycles of contemplation, an action that might facilitate genuine religious development. The division of each day into predetermined segments of prayer, work, and minimal rest creates a mechanical approach to spiritual practice that treats devotion as industrial production rather than organic response to divine presence, requiring monks to manufacture feelings of reverence and worship according to schedule regardless of their actual spiritual state or readiness for meaningful religious experience. The relentless pace of institutional obligations eliminates the spaciousness and flexibility that authentic spiritual practice requires for genuine encounters with transcendent reality, forcing monks to approach prayer and meditation as tasks to be completed rather than opportunities for real communion with divine presence that might occur according to spiritual rather than institutional timing. The monastery's interpretation of punctuality and schedule adherence as spiritual virtues creates psychological pressure that transforms natural human rhythms of attention and energy into sources of guilt and spiritual failure, when individual needs conflict with institutional demands, teaching monks to ignore their own inner spiritual guidance in favor of external religious authority that may actually interfere with authentic spiritual development. The standardization of prayer and worship eliminates the personal and spontaneous elements of religious experience that allow individuals to develop authentic relationships with divine reality according to their unique spiritual gifts and needs, replacing genuine devotion with institutional conformity that serves organizational goals while potentially preventing the kind of personal spiritual growth that might threaten institutional control. The accumulation of prescribed religious activities creates a form of spiritual exhaustion that makes genuine religious experience nearly impossible while maintaining the appearance of intensive devotion through sheer quantity of ritual performance, rather than quality of spiritual engagement or depth of authentic religious understanding and development. The monastery's approach to contemplation and meditation transforms these practices from organic responses to spiritual calling into scheduled activities that must be performed regardless of individual readiness or capacity for meaningful engagement, creating artificial spiritual experiences that serve institutional rather than personal religious development while claiming to represent advanced forms of devotion and religious discipline. The long-term impact of this temporal regimentation reveals itself through the gradual disappearance of spontaneous spiritual response and authentic religious feeling as monks learn to perform devotion rather than experience it, creating individuals who possess technical knowledge of spiritual practices while losing the capacity for genuine religious experience that might provide meaning and purpose beyond institutional survival. The economics of salvation. The monastery's economic structure creates a system where spiritual development becomes subordinated to institutional financial survival, transforming religious practice into productive labor while claiming to represent transcendence of worldly concerns about wealth and material success. This fundamental contradiction poisons every aspect of monastic life, as supposedly spiritual activities serve primarily to generate income and maintain institutional solvency rather than facilitate genuine religious growth or authentic spiritual transformation. The production of manuscripts, brewing, agriculture, and other monastic industries operates according to market pressures that require productivity levels incompatible with the contemplative lifestyle supposedly supported by these economic activities, forcing monks to prioritize quantity and efficiency over quality and spiritual mindfulness in ways that reduce religious practice to disguised commercial enterprise serving customers rather than divine purposes. The monastery's dependence on donations and patronage from wealthy laypeople creates relationships of financial dependency that compromise spiritual independence, while requiring monks to maintain appearances of holiness and devotion that serve institutional marketing rather than authentic religious development, transforming spiritual practice into performance designed to generate financial support rather than facilitate genuine encounter with transcendent reality. The allocation of resources within monastic communities reflects not spiritual principles or human need, but institutional priorities that maintain hierarchical power structures while ensuring adequate resources for community leadership regardless of whether basic needs of ordinary monks receive adequate attention or care that might support their health and spiritual development. The monastery's approach to poverty eliminates individual financial autonomy while concentrating economic power in institutional hands, creating a system where personal spiritual development becomes subordinated to collective economic goals that serve organizational rather than individual religious needs, while claiming to represent higher forms of spiritual discipline and detachment from worldly concerns. The pressure to maintain economic viability forces monasteries to adapt spiritual practices to commercial requirements in ways that corrupt the authenticity of religious experience, while maintaining the appearance of unchanged devotion and traditional spiritual discipline, creating institutions that function as businesses disguised as spiritual communities serving divine rather than financial purposes. The contradiction between monastic ideals of simplicity and the complex economic systems required to maintain institutional survival creates psychological tensions for individuals who entered seeking spiritual development but find themselves participating in economic activities that prioritize material rather than spiritual success while claiming to represent transcendence of worldly values and concerns. The long-term impact of this economic corruption reveals itself through the gradual transformation of monastic communities from spiritual centers into commercial enterprises that use religious imagery and traditional practices to maintain market position while losing connect to the authentic spiritual purposes that supposedly justify their existence and continued operation within broader religious and social contexts. The failure of spiritual direction. The monastery's system of spiritual guidance represents perhaps its most profound failure, as individuals trained primarily in institutional conformity rather than genuine spiritual development attempt to direct the inner lives of others without possessing the psychological understanding or authentic spiritual experience necessary for effective guidance in matters of soul and consciousness that require wisdom rather than mere adherence to predetermined religious formulas. The spiritual directors within monastic communities typically achieve their positions through demonstration of institutional loyalty and rule compliance rather than evidence of genuine spiritual insight or psychological maturity. Creating a system where spiritual guidance comes from individuals who have succeeded primarily in suppressing rather than developing their own spiritual gifts and personal religious understanding. The standardized approach to spiritual direction eliminates the individualized attention and personalized guidance that effective spiritual development requires, treating all monks as identical spiritual entities, requiring identical treatment regardless of their different psychological constitutions, spiritual gifts, cultural backgrounds, or personal religious needs that might benefit from varied approaches to spiritual practice and development. The monastery's interpretation of spiritual problems as failures of obedience rather than natural challenges in religious development creates an approach to spiritual direction that increases rather than resolves psychological difficulties by treating symptoms rather than causes, while eliminating the possibility of addressing underlying issue that might require changes in institutional rather than individual behavior. The enforced silence and limited communication within monastic communities prevents the development of trust and understanding between spiritual directors and those they supposedly guide, creating artificial relationships where genuine spiritual direction becomes impossible because directors lack adequate knowledge of the individuals they attempt to help, while those seeking guidance cannot communicate honestly about their actual spiritual and psychological needs. The institutional pressure to demonstrate spiritual progress according to predetermined markers eliminates the possibility of authentic spiritual assessment and guidance, as both directors and directed focus on external conformity rather than internal development, while losing connection to the genuine spiritual processes that might actually facilitate religious growth and authentic transformation. The monastery's approach to spiritual crisis and psychological difficulty treats these natural aspects of religious development as evidence of spiritual failure rather than opportunities for growth and deeper understanding, creating a system of spiritual direction that increases rather than resolves the very problems it claims to address, while preventing access to the kind of guidance that might actually prove helpful. The long-term impact of inadequate spiritual direction reveals itself through the development of monks who possess technical knowledge of spiritual practices while lacking genuine spiritual experience or psychological integration, creating individuals who can perform religious activities without understanding their purpose while losing connection to the authentic spiritual life that supposedly justifies their institutional commitment and personal sacrifice. The slow death of wonder, perhaps the most tragic aspect of monastic life, lies not in its obvious hardships, but in its systematic destruction of the capacity for wonder, curiosity, and joyful discovery that characterize healthy spiritual development and authentic religious experience, replacing these essential human qualities with mechanical devotion and institutional conformity that serve organizational rather than spiritual purposes, while claiming to represent higher forms of religious consciousness and divine communion. The endless repetition of identical prayers and ritual activities eliminates the freshness and spontaneity that allows spiritual practices to remain meaningful and transformative, creating a psychological environment where devotion becomes performance rather than authentic response to divine presence, while maintaining the appearance of intensive religious practice through sheer quantity rather than quality of spiritual engagement. The monastery's approach to natural beauty and creation treats the physical world as distraction rather than revelation, eliminating opportunities for the kind of contemplation of natural wonder that has historically inspired genuine spiritual insight, while forcing monks to find God only within artificial institutional contexts that may actually obscure rather than reveal divine presence in creation. The suppression of intellectual curiosity and creative expression eliminates the questioning and exploration that allow individuals to develop personal relationships with transcendent reality according to their unique gifts and insights, replacing authentic spiritual development with acceptance of predetermined answers that may prevent rather than facilitate genuine religious understanding and growth. The monastery's interpretation of joy and celebration as worldly attachments eliminates the emotional states that often accompany authentic spiritual experience, while treating psychological well-being as evidence of insufficient spiritual discipline rather than natural result of healthy religious development that serves both individual and community flourishing. The systematic elimination of personal interests and individual talents removes the very qualities that might allow monks to contribute uniquely to community spiritual life, while developing their own gifts in service of genuine religious purposes rather than mere institutional maintenance and survival that serves organizational rather than spiritual goals. The long-term impact of this destruction of wonder reveals itself through the development of individuals who possess extensive knowledge of religious concepts and practices, while lacking the capacity for authentic spiritual experience or genuine encounter with transcendent reality that might provide meaning and purpose beyond institutional survival and conformity to external religious authority. The monastery's success in eliminating wonder and curiosity creates monks who serve institutional purposes effectively, while losing connection to the very spiritual realities that supposedly justify the enormous personal sacrifice required by monastic life, resulting in communities that function as religious organizations while losing touch with authentic spiritual experience and genuine encounter with divine presence that might transform rather than merely constrain human consciousness and development. The ultimate desolation, as our journey through the harsh realities of medieval monastic life draws toward its conclusion, we must confront the ultimate tragedy that emerges from this exploration. Not that such extreme discipline fails to produce saints, but that it systematically destroys the very human qualities that make sainthood possible, creating instead hollow vessels that serve institutional purposes while losing connection to the authentic spiritual life that might have flourished under conditions that respected rather than violated human dignity and individual spiritual calling. The monastery's fundamental error lies in its confusion of suffering with purification, discipline with development, and submission with spiritual growth, creating a system that mistakes the destruction of human personality for spiritual progress while eliminating the joy, creativity, and authentic religious experience that characterize genuine spiritual development and meaningful encounter with transcendent reality. The men who endure this system do so not because they become better human beings, but because they become broken human beings, their natural capacity for growth and development crushed under institutional pressure that serves organizational rather than spiritual purposes while maintaining the fiction of religious community and authentic devotion to divine rather than human authority. The monastery succeeds in creating conformity and institutional loyalty while failing utterly in its supposed purpose of facilitating genuine spiritual development and authentic religious experience, producing individuals who can perform religious activities without understanding their meaning, while losing connection to the very spiritual realities that might justify their enormous personal sacrifice and institutional commitment. Yet even as we recognize the profound tragedy of this systematic destruction of human potential in service of institutional goals disguised as spiritual purposes, we must also acknowledge that something in the human spirit continues to respond to ideals of complete devotion and total surrender to purposes greater than individual desire, even when those ideals become corrupted through institutional implementation that serves power rather than spiritual development. The enduring appeal of monastic ideals speaks to deep human needs for meaning, purpose, and transcendence that contemporary culture often fails to address adequately, while the failure of historical monastic institutions reminds us that the corruption of spiritual ideals through institutional power creates suffering that serves no divine purpose while destroying the very human qualities that might allow for authentic spiritual transformation and genuine religious development. As you return to your modern life with its freedoms and choices and possibilities for individual development and authentic spiritual exploration, you carry with you not just appreciation for contemporary privileges, but deeper understanding of what authentic spiritual life might require, not the destruction of human personality, but its transformation, not the elimination of individual gifts, but their development in service of genuine spiritual purposes, not submission to institutional authority, but growing relationship with transcendent reality that respects rather than violates human dignity and individual spiritual calling. The monastery walls may continue to whisper of devotion and sacrifice, but they also speak of human tragedy that serves as warning rather than inspiration, reminding us that any authentic spiritual path must serve human flourishing rather than institutional power, must facilitate rather than prevent genuine spiritual development, and must respect rather than destroy the individual dignity and personal gifts that make each soul capable of unique contribution to the great work of spiritual evolution and authentic religious transformation that benefits both individual and community in ways that honor rather than violate the sacred nature of human consciousness and spiritual calling. In the end, you would not endure such a life not because you lack spiritual commitment or religious devotion, but because you possess sufficient spiritual wisdom to recognize that true religious development requires freedom rather than coercion, creativity rather than conformity, and respect for individual dignity rather than its systematic destruction in service of institutional goals that confuse organizational survival with spiritual purpose while eliminating the very human qualities that make authentic spiritual transformation possible and meaningful for both individual souls and religious communities committed to genuine rather than artificial spiritual development, authentic encounter with transcendent reality. The corruption of sacred space, every corner of the monastery bears witness to the fundamental contradiction between the sacred purposes these spaces claim to serve and the human suffering they systematically perpetuate, creating environments that should facilitate encounter with divine presence, but instead become instruments of psychological manipulation and spiritual oppression disguised as holy ground deserving reverence rather than critical examination of their actual impact on human consciousness and authentic religious development. The chapel, that supposed heart of monastic spiritual life, reveals its true nature through architectural and liturgical elements, designed more to induce submission than inspire genuine worship, with altar arrangements that emphasize human unworthiness rather than divine love, seating that prioritizes discomfort over contemplation, and acoustic properties that amplify institutional authority, while diminishing individual spiritual expression and personal response to divine presence. The positioning of religious imagery within monastery spaces serves not to inspire authentic devotion, but to reinforce institutional messages about proper spiritual attitudes and acceptable religious responses, creating visual environments that constantly remind inhabitants of their expected role as passive recipients of predetermined spiritual truths rather than active participants in ongoing divine revelation that might challenge or transcend institutional limitations and orthodox interpretations. The use of light and shadow throughout monastic buildings creates psychological atmospheres designed to induce specific emotional states that serve institutional rather than spiritual purposes, with illumination patterns that emphasize mystery and unknowing while discouraging the kind of clear thinking and honest questioning that might lead to genuine spiritual insight or recognition of institutional failures to support authentic religious development. The spatial organization of sacred areas reflects hierarchical assumptions about spiritual authority and religious truth that eliminate the possibility of democratic spiritual community or shared spiritual authority among equals seeking divine guidance together, creating physical environments that reinforce social divisions and spiritual inequality while claiming to represent transcendence of worldly power structures and material concerns. The maintenance and decoration of sacred spaces requires enormous expenditure of human labor and community resources that might otherwise support human well-being and genuine spiritual development. creating situations where the preservation of institutional symbols becomes more important than the care of human souls supposedly served by these symbols and the spiritual purposes they claim to represent. The monastery's approach to sacred space eliminates the natural human tendency to create beautiful environments that inspire joy and wonder, replacing aesthetic appreciation with institutional symbolism that serves organizational rather than spiritual purposes, while claiming to represent higher forms of beauty and divine inspiration that transcend worldly aesthetic experience and personal artistic response. The psychological impact of spending years within spaces designed to induce submission rather than inspiration reveals itself through the gradual erosion of natural human responses to beauty, mystery, and transcendence. As monks learn to experience sacred space according to institutional expectations rather than authentic personal spiritual response that might lead to genuine religious insight and transformative encounter with divine presence. The corruption of sacred space extends beyond architectural considerations into the realm of symbolic meaning and spiritual interpretation, as locations that should represent divine presence become associated primarily with human suffering and institutional control, creating psychological associations that may permanently damage individual capacity for healthy spiritual experience and authentic religious development even after leaving the monastic environment. The pathology of collective prayer. The monastery's approach to communal worship transforms what should be joyful celebration of divine presence and shared spiritual experience into mechanical group performance that serves institutional rather than spiritual purposes, creating forms of collective prayer that actually inhibit rather than facilitate genuine religious experience, while maintaining the appearance of intensive devotion and authentic spiritual community. The standardization of liturgical response eliminates the spontaneity and personal authenticity that allow individual participants to contribute their unique spiritual gifts to collective worship, replacing genuine community prayer with synchronized performance that prioritizes uniformity over spiritual authenticity, while treating individual variation as disruption rather than valuable contribution to shared religious experience. The predetermined nature of liturgical content prevents the kind of responsive prayer that might address actual community needs or reflect authentic spiritual concerns of participants, forcing monks to recite prayers that may have no relationship to their current spiritual state or genuine religious needs while maintaining the fiction of meaningful collective worship and authentic spiritual community. The physical demands of extended communal prayer create conditions of fatigue and discomfort that make genuine spiritual focus nearly impossible, while requiring continued participation regardless of individual capacity for meaningful engagement, transforming worship from opportunity for authentic encounter with divine presence into endurance test that measures institutional loyalty rather than spiritual development. The acoustic environment of collective chanting eliminates individual voice and personal expression in favor of institutional harmony that may actually obscure rather than reveal divine presence, creating auditory experiences that serve organizational aesthetics rather than authentic spiritual communication, while claiming to represent transcendent forms of prayer and divine worship. The psychological pressure to maintain perfect participation in collective prayer eliminates the internal freedom necessary for authentic spiritual response, forcing monks to focus on external performance rather than internal spiritual development, while creating anxiety about liturgical correctness that interferes with genuine religious experience and personal encounter with transcendent reality. The monastery's interpretation of collective prayer as superior to individual spiritual practice eliminates opportunities for personal religious development and authentic spiritual exploration that might complement rather than compete with community worship, creating artificial divisions between individual and communal spirituality that serve institutional control rather than genuine spiritual development. The long-term impact of mechanized collective prayer reveals itself through the development of individuals who can participate in elaborate liturgical performances while losing connection to authentic spiritual experience and genuine personal relationship with divine reality, creating communities that excel at religious ceremony while failing in their supposed purpose of facilitating authentic spiritual development and meaningful encounter with transcendent truth. The corruption of collective prayer creates psychological associations between community worship and spiritual oppression that may permanently damage individual capacity for healthy participation in authentic religious community and shared spiritual experience, even in contexts that might genuinely support rather than exploit human spiritual needs and religious aspirations. The perversion of sacred reading. The monastery's approach to sacred texts and spiritual literature transforms what should be nourishing spiritual food into instruments of institutional control and psychological manipulation, creating educational systems that produce religious literacy without spiritual understanding, while eliminating the personal engagement and authentic questioning that allow written spiritual wisdom to facilitate genuine religious development and transformative encounter with divine truth. The predetermined interpretation of sacred texts eliminates the possibility of personal spiritual insight or individual religious understanding that might develop through authentic engagement with spiritual literature according to personal spiritual needs and unique individual calling, rather than institutional orthodoxy that serves organizational rather than spiritual purposes. The requirement to approach sacred reading with predetermined attitudes and expected responses prevents the kind of honest questioning and intellectual engagement that allows spiritual texts to speak to individual circumstances and personal spiritual development in ways that might transcend or challenge institutional interpretations and orthodox religious understanding. The emphasis on memorization rather than comprehension creates educational systems where monks can recite extensive passages from spiritual literature without understanding their meaning or relevance to personal spiritual development and authentic religious experience that might actually benefit from engagement with written spiritual wisdom and traditional religious teaching. The prohibition against comparative reading and alternative interpretations eliminates access to the broader spiritual traditions and diverse religious wisdom that might provide context and balance for individual spiritual development, while preventing the kind of intellectual and spiritual exploration that characterizes healthy religious growth and authentic spiritual maturity. The institutional control over access to reading materials ensures that monks encounter only texts that support existing power structures and orthodox interpretations, while eliminating exposure to spiritual literature that might encourage independent thinking or alternative approaches to religious development that could challenge institutional authority and establish spiritual orthodoxy. The monastery's interpretation of intellectual curiosity and scholarly questioning as forms of spiritual pride eliminates the very mental activities that allow written spiritual wisdom to transform consciousness and facilitate authentic religious development through genuine engagement with traditional spiritual teaching and religious literature. The corruption of sacred reading creates psychological associations between spiritual literature and institutional oppression that may permanently damage individual capacity for beneficial engagement with written spiritual wisdom and traditional religious teaching, even in contexts that might genuinely support rather than exploit personal spiritual development and authentic religious experience. The long-term impact of perverted sacred reading reveals itself through the development of individuals who possess extensive knowledge of religious texts while lacking the capacity for personal spiritual insight or authentic religious understanding that might actually benefit from engagement with spiritual literature and traditional wisdom designed to support rather than prevent genuine spiritual development. The failure of contemplative practice. The monastery's systematic approach to contemplation and meditation represents perhaps its most tragic failure, as practices that should facilitate direct encounter with transcendent reality become mechanized activities performed according to schedule rather than spiritual readiness, creating artificial spiritual experiences that serve institutional rather than divine purposes, while eliminating authentic contemplative development and genuine mystical experience. The standardization of contemplative techniques eliminates the individual spiritual guidance and personalized instruction necessary for effective contemplative practice, treating all monks as identical contemplatives requiring identical methods regardless of their different psychological constitutions, spiritual gifts, and personal contemplative calling that might benefit from varied approaches to meditation and spiritual practice. The predetermined schedule for contemplative activities ignores the natural rhythms of contemplative readiness and spiritual receptivity that characterize authentic mystical development, forcing monks to attempt contemplation according to institutional timing rather than spiritual preparation and divine invitation that might actually facilitate genuine contemplative experience and authentic mystical encounter. The institutional interpretation of contemplative success through external markers rather than internal spiritual development creates competitive dynamics that corrupt contemplative practice by introducing concerns about performance and achievement that directly predict the receptivity and surrender necessary for authentic contemplative experience and genuine mystical development. The monastery's approach to contemplative difficulties and spiritual dryness treats natural challenges in contemplative development as evidence of spiritual failure rather than normal aspects of authentic mystical growth that require patient endurance and continued practice rather than increased institutional discipline and additional spiritual activities that may actually interfere with contemplative development. The elimination of individual contemplative guidance and personal spiritual direction prevents access to the kind of experienced contemplative mentorship that authentic mystical development requires for safe navigation of the psychological and spiritual challenges that characterize genuine contemplative practice and advanced spiritual development. The corruption of contemplative practice through institutional systematization creates artificial mystical experiences that serve organizational rather than spiritual purposes, while eliminating access to authentic contemplative development and genuine mystical encounter with divine reality that might actually justify the personal sacrifice and spiritual commitment required by serious contemplative practice. The long-term impact of failed contemplative practice reveals itself through the development of individuals who can perform elaborate meditation techniques while lacking genuine contemplative experience or authentic mystical development, creating monks who excel at contemplative performance while missing the actual spiritual transformation that contemplative practice should facilitate. The monastery's success in systematizing contemplation eliminates the mystery and divine initiative that characterize authentic mystical experience while maintaining the appearance of advanced contemplative practice and intensive spiritual development that may actually prevent rather than facilitate genuine encounter with transcendent reality and authentic spiritual transformation. The corruption of spiritual authority. The monastery's hierarchical system of spiritual authority represents a fundamental corruption of authentic religious leadership, creating power structures where spiritual authority serves institutional rather than divine purposes while eliminating the kinds of spiritual guidance and religious mentorship that might actually support individual spiritual development and authentic religious growth within genuine spiritual community. The selection of spiritual authorities based on institutional loyalty rather than authentic spiritual development ensures that positions of religious leadership go to individuals who excel at organizational conformity, while lacking the spiritual wisdom and psychological maturity necessary for effective guidance of souls seeking genuine religious development and authentic spiritual transformation. The concentration of spiritual authority in institutional positions eliminates the possibility of distributed spiritual leadership and shared religious authority that might better serve diverse individual needs and varied approaches to spiritual development within authentic religious communities committed to supporting rather than controlling individuals' spiritual growth and personal religious calling. The monastery's interpretation of spiritual authority as institutional power rather than service to individual spiritual development creates relationships between spiritual directors and those they supposedly guide that serve organizational rather than religious purposes, while maintaining the fiction of authentic spiritual mentorship and genuine religious guidance. The systematic elimination of alternative sources of spiritual authority and religious guidance ensures that monks receive only institutional interpretation of their spiritual experiences and religious development, preventing access to diverse perspectives and alternative approaches that might better support individual spiritual needs and personal religious growth. The corruption of spiritual authority through institutional power creates psychological dynamics where authentic spiritual development becomes subordinated to maintaining relationships with religious authorities who possess power over basic necessities and community standing, rather than wisdom about spiritual development and religious growth that might actually benefit individual souls seeking genuine transformation. The monastery's approach to spiritual authority eliminates accountability and transparency that might ensure that religious leadership serves spiritual rather than institutional purposes, creating systems where spiritual authorities answer only to other institutional authorities rather than to those they supposedly serve, or to divine authority that might actually guide authentic religious leadership. The long-term impact of corrupted spiritual authority reveals itself through the development of religious communities where spiritual leadership serves organizational survival rather than individual spiritual development, creating institutions that excel at maintaining power structures while failing in their supposed purpose of facilitating authentic spiritual growth and genuine religious transformation. The systematic corruption of spiritual authority creates psychological associations between religious leadership and institutional oppression that may permanently damage individual capacity for healthy relationship with authentic spiritual authorities and beneficial religious guidance, even in contexts that might genuinely support rather than exploit individual spiritual development and personal religious growth. The violence of enforced celibacy. The monastery's requirement of complete celibacy represents not merely sexual abstinence, but systematic violence against fundamental aspects of human nature and psychological development, creating artificial constraints on natural human capacity for intimacy and emotional connection, while claiming to facilitate higher forms of spiritual development and divine love that transcend human relationship and worldly attachment. The psychological impact of enforced celibacy extends far beyond sexual abstinence into realms of emotional intimacy and human connection that are essential for healthy psychological development and authentic spiritual growth, eliminating opportunities for the kinds of loving relationships that actually support rather than interfere with genuine religious development and spiritual maturity. The monastery's interpretation of sexual desire and romantic attraction as spiritual obstacles rather than natural human capacities that might be integrated into authentic spiritual development creates internal conflicts that drain psychological energy and spiritual focus, while maintaining the fiction that celibacy automatically produces higher forms of religious consciousness and divine love. The elimination of family relationships and intimate partnerships removes access to the kinds of unconditional love and mutual support that provides psychological foundation for healthy spiritual development and authentic religious growth, forcing monks to seek these essential human needs through institutional relationships that may serve organizational rather than personal spiritual purposes. The systematic suppression of natural human desires for physical affection and emotional intimacy creates psychological tensions that may manifest as spiritual problems requiring institutional intervention rather than recognition that healthy human nature includes capacities for love and relationship that support rather than threaten authentic spiritual development and genuine religious experience. The monastery's approach to celibacy treats human sexuality and capacity for intimate relationship as corruptions of spiritual purity rather than divine gifts that might be expressed in ways that enhance rather than diminish spiritual development and authentic religious experience within contexts that honor both human nature and spiritual calling. The long-term psychological impact of enforced celibacy includes not only sexual dysfunction, but broader difficulties with emotional intimacy and human relationship that may permanently damage individual capacity for healthy love and authentic spiritual community. Even after leaving the monastic environment and returning to contexts where intimate relationships are possible and encouraged, the corruption of celibacy through institutional enforcement eliminates the possibility of freely chosen abstinence that might actually support individual spiritual development in favor of mandatory restrictions that serve institutional control while maintaining the fiction of voluntary spiritual discipline and authentic religious commitment. The monastery's success in enforcing celibacy creates monks who function without intimate human relationships while losing connection to natural human capacities for love and emotional connection that actually support rather than interfere with authentic spiritual development and genuine encounter with divine love that includes rather than excludes human affection and intimate relationship. The pathology of religious conformity. The monastery's demand for absolute religious conformity eliminates the individual spiritual exploration and personal religious development that characterize healthy spiritual growth, replacing authentic spiritual seeking with institutional orthodoxy that serves organizational rather than divine purposes, while claiming to represent traditional religious wisdom and established spiritual truth. The standardization of religious belief and spiritual practice prevents the kind of personal theological reflection and individual spiritual discernment that allow individuals to develop authentic faith according to their unique spiritual gifts and personal religious calling, rather than predetermined institutional formulas that may actually interfere with genuine spiritual development and authentic religious experience. The punishment of theological questioning and spiritual doubt eliminates the intellectual and spiritual processes that historically drive authentic religious development and genuine spiritual growth, treating natural aspects of healthy faith development as evidence of spiritual failure rather than opportunities for deeper religious understanding and authentic spiritual maturity. The monastery's interpretation of religious diversity and alternative spiritual perspectives as threats rather than opportunities for learning creates intellectual environments where authentic theological education becomes impossible while maintaining the appearance of intensive religious instruction that of advanced spiritual training that may actually prevent rather than facilitate genuine religious understanding and spiritual development. The elimination of access to diverse religious traditions and alternative spiritual practices prevents the kind of comparative spiritual study that might enrich rather than threaten individual religious development, while ensuring institutional control over spiritual education and religious formation that serves organizational rather than spiritual purposes. The systematic suppression of individual spiritual insights and personal religious experiences that might challenge or transcend institutional orthodoxy eliminates opportunities for authentic spiritual contribution to community religious life, while maintaining centralized control over spiritual authority and religious interpretation that may actually impede rather than facilitate genuine spiritual development. The monastery's approach to religious conformity treats spiritual uniformity as evidence of authentic religious community while eliminating the diversity of spiritual gifts and varied religious perspectives that characterize healthy spiritual communities committed to supporting rather than controlling individual spiritual development and personal religious growth. The long-term impact of enforced religious conformity reveals itself through the development of individuals who can recite orthodox religious formulas while lacking authentic personal faith or genuine spiritual experience that might actually justify their institutional religious commitment and personal spiritual sacrifice. The corruption of religious community through mandatory conformity creates psychological associations between religious practice and spiritual oppression that may permanently damage individual capacity for healthy participation in authentic religious community and beneficial spiritual fellowship, even in contexts that might genuinely support rather than exploit individual spiritual development and personal religious calling. The economics of spiritual exploitation. The monastery's economic model depends fundamentally on the systematic exploitation of unpaid labor disguised as spiritual discipline, creating financial systems where individual spiritual commitment serves institutional economic interests, while maintaining the fiction of otherworldly focus and divine rather than material priorities in community life and spiritual development. The extraction of economic value from monastic labor occurs without providing adequate compensation in terms of food, shelter, healthcare, or spiritual guidance that might justify the economic sacrifice required from individuals who surrender worldly income and material security in exchange for supposedly superior forms of spiritual development and religious community. The monastery's dependence on volunteer labor creates economic advantages that allow institutional survival and growth, while preventing the kinds of fair labor practices and adequate compensation that might support both individual well-being and authentic spiritual development within religious communities committed to justice and human dignity rather than economic exploitation, disguised spiritual discipline. The accumulation of wealth within monastic institutions creates disparities between the material conditions of institutional leadership and ordinary monks that contradict spiritual ideals of simplicity and equality, while concentrating economic resources in ways that serve organizational rather than spiritual purposes and individual rather than community development. The marketing of monastic products and services depends on maintaining public images of spiritual authenticity and religious devotion that may bear little relationship to actual working conditions or individual spiritual development within communities that function primarily as commercial enterprises disguised as religious institutions serving divine rather than financial purposes. The monastery's approach to economic self-sufficiency requires levels of productivity and commercial success that subordinate spiritual practices and individual well-being to financial considerations, while maintaining the appearance of integrated spiritual and economic life that actually serves material rather than spiritual purposes and institutional rather than individual development. The long-term economic impact of monastic exploitation creates systems where individual spiritual sacrifice supports institutional wealth accumulation while providing minimal benefit to those who contribute their labor and life commitment to communities that claim to serve spiritual rather than economic purposes and divine rather than organizational goals. The corruption of spiritual community through economic exploitation creates relationships where authentic religious fellowship becomes impossible due to underlying economic dynamics that prioritize institutional survival over individual spiritual development and material success over genuine spiritual growth and authentic religious community. The monastery's success in disguising economic exploitation as spiritual discipline eliminates recognition of the fundamental injustice inherent in systems that extract economic value from spiritual commitment while providing inadequate material and spiritual support for those whose sacrifice makes institutional survival and growth possible. The destruction of individual spiritual gifts. The monastery's systematic suppression of individual spiritual gifts and unique religious talents represents perhaps its most profound spiritual failure, eliminating the diverse contributions that might enrich authentic religious community, while forcing all monks to conform to identical patterns of spiritual practice and religious expression that serve institutional rather than divine purposes. The standardization of spiritual practice eliminates opportunities for individuals to develop and contribute their unique spiritual gifts according to personal calling and divine inspiration, replacing authentic spiritual diversity with institutional uniformity that claims to represent traditional spiritual wisdom while actually preventing the kind of spiritual development that might transcend organizational limitations and orthodox interpretations. The monastery's interpretation of individual spiritual gifts as potential sources of pride and spiritual danger eliminates the very qualities that might allow monks to contribute uniquely to community spiritual life while developing their own authentic spiritual identity and personal religious calling within contexts of genuine spiritual fellowship and mutual support. The suppression of creative spiritual expression and innovative religious practice prevents the kind of spiritual exploration and religious development that historically drive authentic spiritual growth and genuine religious renewal, treating individual spiritual initiative as threat rather than gift that might benefit both personal and community spiritual development. The elimination of opportunities for individual spiritual leadership and personal religious contribution creates communities where spiritual authority remains concentrated in institutional positions while preventing the kind of distributed spiritual gifts and shared religious responsibility that characterize healthy spiritual communities committed to supporting rather than controlling individual spiritual development. The monastery's approach to spiritual formation treats all individuals as requiring identical spiritual development and uniform religious education regardless of their different spiritual gifts, psychological constitutions, and personal religious calling that might benefit from varied approaches to spiritual practice and individualized religious guidance and formation. The systematic destruction of individual spiritual identity creates monks who function as interchangeable institutional components while losing connection to their unique spiritual calling and personal religious identity, might actually contribute to authentic spiritual community and genuine religious development within contexts that honor rather than suppress individual spiritual gifts. The long-term impact of suppressed spiritual gifts reveals itself through the development of religious communities that lack the spiritual vitality and creative religious expression that diverse individual contributions might provide, while maintaining the appearance of intensive spiritual practice through institutional programs that actually prevent rather than facilitate authentic spiritual development. The corruption of spiritual community through suppression of individual gifts creates environments where authentic spiritual fellowship becomes impossible due to artificial uniformity that eliminates the spiritual diversity and varied religious perspective that characterize healthy religious communities committed to supporting rather than controlling individual spiritual development and personal religious calling. The failure of authentic worship, the monastery's approach to worship transforms what should be joyful celebration of divine presence and authentic spiritual expression into mechanical ritual performance that serves institutional rather than spiritual purposes, creating forms of religious worship that actually inhibit rather than facilitate genuine encounter with transcendent reality while maintaining appearances of intensive devotion and authentic spiritual community. The predetermined nature of liturgical worship eliminates the spontaneity and authentic spiritual response that allow worship to become genuine encounter with divine presence, rather than institutional performance designed to demonstrate religious orthodoxy and spiritual conformity that may actually prevent rather than facilitate authentic religious experience and genuine spiritual development. The emphasis on liturgical correctness and ritual precision creates psychological pressure that interferes with the internal freedom and spiritual receptivity necessary for authentic worship, while forcing participants to focus on external performance rather than internal spiritual engagement and genuine religious response to divine presence and transcendent reality. The standardization of worship response eliminates individual spiritual expression and personal religious contribution that might enrich collective worship, while treating authentic spiritual diversity as disruption rather than gift that could benefit community spiritual life and shared religious experience within contexts of genuine spiritual fellowship and mutual support. The monastery's interpretation of worship as institutional obligation rather than spiritual opportunity eliminates the voluntary character and authentic spiritual motivation that make worship meaningful, while creating artificial religious experiences that serve organizational rather than spiritual purposes and human rather than divine authority. The corruption of worship through institutional systematization prevents the kind of authentic spiritual community and genuine religious fellowship that emerge when individuals gather freely to celebrate shared spiritual experience and mutual religious commitment, rather than fulfill organizational requirements and institutional expectations that may interfere with rather than support authentic spiritual development. The long-term impact of mechanized worship reveals itself through the development of individuals who can participate in elaborate religious ceremonies while losing connection to authentic spiritual experience and genuine personal relationship with divine reality that worship should facilitate rather than prevent through institutional control and organizational systematization. The monastery's success in controlling worship eliminates the divine initiative and spiritual spontaneity that characterize authentic religious experience, while maintaining appearances of intensive devotional practice and advanced spiritual development that may actually serve institutional rather than spiritual purposes and organizational rather than divine goals. The destruction of authentic worship creates psychological associations between religious ceremony and spiritual oppression that may permanently damage individual capacity for healthy participation in genuine worship and beneficial religious community, even in contexts that might actually support rather than exploit authentic spiritual development and personal religious experience. The psychology of spiritual stagnation, the accumulated impact of monastic restrictions and institutional control creates psychological conditions where authentic spiritual development becomes, if religious serve to disguise fundamental spiritual stagnation, that benefits organizational stability at the expense of individual spiritual growth, genuine challenge existing pattern which establishes spiritual meaning, loss of the path of the orthodoxy. The elimination of spiritual challenge and religious growth opportunities ensures that monks remain psychologically and spiritually dependent on institutional guidance and organizational support, while losing the capacity for independent spiritual development and autonomous religious judgment that might lead to authentic spiritual maturity and genuine religious wisdom beyond institutional limitations and orthodox interpretations. The monastery's approach to spiritual formation creates artificial markers of religious progress that measure institutional conformity rather than authentic spiritual development, ensuring that apparent spiritual advancement serves organizational rather than divine purposes, while preventing recognition of actual spiritual stagnation and religious decline that may characterize individual experience within systems designed to control rather than facilitate genuine spiritual growth. The systematic prevention of spiritual crisis and religious questioning eliminates the challenges and difficulties that historically drive authentic spiritual development and genuine religious growth, creating artificial spiritual stability that prevents rather than facilitates the kind of spiritual transformation and religious development that might lead to authentic spiritual maturity and genuine religious wisdom. The monastery's interpretation of spiritual contentment and religious satisfaction as evidence of spiritual progress eliminates recognition that authentic spiritual development requires ongoing challenge and continued growth that may produce temporary discomfort and religious uncertainty rather than permanent satisfaction and spiritual complacency that serves institutional rather than spiritual purposes. The corruption of spiritual guidance through institutional control ensures that monks receive interpretation of their spiritual experience according to organizational rather than spiritual criteria, while preventing access to authentic spiritual mentorship and genuine religious guidance that might actually support individual spiritual development and personal religious growth beyond institutional limitations. The long-term psychological impact of spiritual stagnation reveals itself through the development of individuals who possess extensive knowledge of spiritual concepts and religious practices while lacking genuine spiritual experience or authentic religious development that might actually justify their institutional spiritual commitment and personal religious sacrifice. The monastery's success in preventing spiritual development creates monks who serve organizational purposes effectively while losing connection to authentic spiritual life and genuine religious experience that might provide meaning and purpose beyond institutional survival and organizational maintenance that benefits structure rather than souls supposedly served by religious community and spiritual institution. The ultimate spiritual tragedy as our exploration of monastic life reaches its deepest level of analysis. We must confront the ultimate spiritual tragedy that emerges from this systematic examination, not merely that such institutions fail to produce authentic spiritual development, but that they actively prevent and destroy the very human capacities that make genuine spiritual growth possible while claiming to represent the highest forms of religious devotion and divine service. The monastery's fundamental error lies not in its aspiration towards spiritual transcendence, but in its systematic confusion of spiritual discipline with psychological destruction, religious authority with institutional control, and divine service with organizational conformity that eliminates the individual spiritual freedom and authentic religious experience necessary for genuine encounter with transcendent reality and meaningful spiritual transformation. The tragic irony of monastic existence reveals itself through the recognition that individuals who sacrifice everything for spiritual development find themselves trapped within systems that eliminate the very possibilities for spiritual growth that might have justified their enormous personal sacrifice and radical commitment to religious life, supporting dedicated to facilitating authentic spiritual development and genuine religious transformation. The monastery succeeds brilliantly in creating institutional stability and organizational continuity, while failing utterly in its supposed spiritual purposes, producing individuals who can maintain elaborate religious systems while losing connection to the authentic spiritual life and genuine religious experience that might provide meaning and justification for the enormous personal cost required by such radical institutional commitment. The human cost of this spiritual failure extends far beyond individual suffering into realms of lost spiritual potential and unrealized religious contribution that might have enriched both individual lives and broader human spiritual development through authentic spiritual communities, committed to supporting rather than controlling individual spiritual growth and personal religious calling according to divine, rather than institutional purposes. The monastery's legacy of spiritual destruction continues to influence contemporary understanding of spiritual discipline and religious commitment in ways that perpetuate confusion between authentic spiritual development and institutional conformity, while preventing recognition of healthier approaches to spiritual community, a religious practice that might actually support rather than destroy human spiritual potential and individual religious calling. The recognition of monastic spiritual failure serves not merely as historical critique, but as warning about persistent human tendencies to create religious institutions that serve organizational rather than spiritual purposes, while claiming divine authority and spiritual authenticity that may actually interfere with rather than facilitate genuine spiritual development and authentic religious experience. Yet even within this profound tragedy lies seeds of authentic spiritual wisdom for those capable of learning from historical failure rather than repeating it. The understanding that genuine spiritual development requires freedom rather than coercion, creativity rather than conformity, and respect for individual spiritual gifts rather than their systematic destruction in service of institutional goals disguised as spiritual purposes and divine requirements. The monastery walls that once imprisoned souls seeking spiritual freedom now serve as monuments to human spiritual resilience and divine mercy that transcend institutional failure, reminding us that authentic spiritual life persists, despite rather than because of systems designed to control rather than liberate the human spirit created for genuine spiritual development and authentic encounter with transcendent reality that honors rather than violates human dignity and individual spiritual calling. The return to authentic spirituality as we prepare to leave these ancient walls and return to the contemporary world with its possibilities for authentic spiritual development and genuine religious experience. We carry with us not merely appreciation for modern freedoms, but deeper understanding of what authentic spiritual life requires and how genuine religious communities might support rather than destroy individual spiritual potential and personal religious calling. The lessons learned through this exploration of monastic failure provide foundation for recognizing and creating healthy approaches to spiritual community and religious practice that honor both human dignity and divine, calling to avoid and corruptions and transitions and organizational pathologies that transpose and spiritual institutions into systems of human exploitation and as political destruction. There's a religious version of spiritual discipline. The contrast between monastic oppression and authentic spiritual freedom illuminates possibilities for religious communities committed to supporting individual spiritual development and personal religious growth within contexts of genuine spiritual fellowship that serve divine rather than institutional purposes, or respecting rather than violating human nature, individual spiritual gifts. The recognition of institutional spiritual failure opens possibilities for authentic spiritual communities based on voluntary association and mutual spiritual support rather than hierarchical control and organizational conformity, creating environments where individual spiritual gifts contribute to collective spiritual development while personal religious calling receives support rather than suppression within contexts of genuine spiritual freedom and authentic religious fellowship. The understanding of how spiritual institutions can corrupt and destroy authentic religious experience provides wisdom for maintaining healthy boundaries and critical discernment in relationship to religious authorities and spiritual communities, while remaining open to genuine spiritual guidance and authentic religious fellowship that supports and exploits individual spiritual development and personal religious growth. The monastery's failure to facilitate authentic spiritual development reminds us that genuine spiritual communities must serve individual spiritual flourishing rather than institutional survival, while maintaining commitment to divine purposes rather than organizational goals that may actually support the spiritual development and religious growth of individuals seeking spiritual community and genuine religious fellowship. As you return to your comfortable bed, and abundant food and freedom to speak and choose your spiritual truth according to your individual calling and personal religious development, you carry deeper appreciation not only for contemporary privileges, but for the possibilities of authentic spiritual life that honors rather than destroys human dignity, while facilitating rather than preventing genuine encounter with transcendent reality and meaningful spiritual transformation. The monastery's whispered legacy of suffering and control serves now as counterpoint to possibilities for spiritual communities based on love rather than fear, freedom rather than coercion, and mutual support rather than hierarchical domination, creating contexts where authentic spiritual development can flourish according to divine rather than institutional purposes, while respecting the sacred dignity of each individual soul seeking genuine spiritual growth and authentic religious experience. In the end, you would not endure monastic life not because you lack spiritual commitment or religious devotion, but because you possess sufficient spiritual wisdom to recognize that authentic spiritual development requires conditions that honor rather than violate human nature, while facilitating rather than preventing genuine encounter with divine reality that respects individual gifts and personal religious calling rather than demanding their sacrifice to institutional goals and organizational purposes that serve human rather than divine authority, rather than through kingdom. The ancient stones may continue whispering their tales of sacrifice and suffering, but they also speak of human spiritual resilience and divine love that transcend institutional failure, pointing toward possibilities for authentic spiritual communities and genuine religious fellowship that serve divine purposes of human flourishing and spiritual development, rather than organizational goals of institutional survival and hierarchical control that corrupt rather than facilitate authentic spiritual life and genuine religious experience.